Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out, checking out this session. As Mallory mentioned, I'm Nelson Petracek, CTO at TIBCO. I've been at TIBCO a number of years, actually been at TIBCO twice, and had the opportunity to be at TIBCO from about 2000, 2009. And as everybody says, I took a bit of a vacation in between and then came back to TIBCO in 2014, and I've been acting as the CTO ever since. And so today I thought we could do just kind of a general overview session. I had again the opportunity to write a book, which was a fun and also very much a learning process for myself. But the book itself, it was a good chance for me to kind of sit down and look at how different organizations are approaching the development of API programs, and to capture a lot of how people have been successful in written form, so that we can share that information with other organizations, other people. So today we're just going to cover some highlights from the book. We're going to talk about some key points from different chapters. I've marked out which chapters actually some of the key points come from, so you can always go back and check it out. But we're just going to kind of touch on some of those points, and then of course leave some time at the end for questions and comments. So just to get started, just one slide from a who's TIBCO standpoint. For people that have known TIBCO for a while, you know that, of course, we've been around for 25 plus years. We started with a handful of products, and now the product range is quite broad. When you look at our portfolios, we really break everything down into essentially 3 domain capability areas. And so we'll talk a lot about the connect pillar, we'll talk a lot about the unify pillar, and we'll talk about the predict pillar. And really for today, when it comes to APIs, of course, can apply across all these different capabilities. So whether you're looking at analytics, whether you're looking at topics such as model ops, data ops, whether you're looking at things like data management, data virtualization, or whether you're looking at microservices, function as a service architectures, and so on, APIs can really apply across all 3 of these pillars. But from a capability standpoint and from a TIBCO perspective, we often include APIs in our connect pillar. So a lot of cases in the ways in which people want to connect to services or information or applications or whatever that is, they want to do so through, of course, API-led integration strategies. And so that is the core of what we do in the connect pillar. But of course, as I mentioned, APIs can apply to the other pillars as well. And we'll touch upon that a little bit as we go throughout the session. All right, so just to talk a little bit about APIs, I don't think I would need to describe to this audience likely too much around the importance of APIs. I mean, we still do see that as the way in which organizations are really driving a lot of their digital transformation initiatives. So I've been talking to a number of organizations across the globe, and a lot of them are, and especially this year, Mallory and I were just commenting on the interesting year that we're having this year. From a global perspective, I haven't probably traveled anywhere since March, which is very unusual for me. But when I talk to customers, their ability to actually quickly pivot and offer new capabilities and services in a new form, and also in some cases, a lot of that has been facilitated or has been enriched through the capabilities that APIs have brought them. And so a lot of the work that we do is around helping companies understand how APIs can be utilized to leverage these kinds of shifts, these kinds of transitions. Right? So APIs are a very key component of a lot of organizations' digital transformation strategies. And of course, APIs can be applied in many different contexts. I call this my buzzword compliance slide, if you will. But when you look at it, organizations are looking to build modern applications by, first of all, enabling and starting with APIs. And there's many different forms. APIs are no longer just about request reply. We'll talk a little bit about that. But when you look at APIs and the way in which people are building modern applications, it's really also encompassing things like serverless or function as a service capabilities. We do a lot of work with IoT and edge computing. We have a TIBCO Labs program called Project Air, which falls under that umbrella, but it's very much around leveraging APIs all the way out to the edge, as well as analytics at the edge. Of course, APIs and service meshes, that conversation often goes hand in hand. You've got analytics as APIs. You've got, again, different forms of APIs, including very event-driven APIs, and then different patterns. So these are things like sagas, event sourcing, CQRS. These are all related conversations when it comes to APIs themselves. So as organizations look to modernize the way in which they build applications, These are some of the technology areas and patterns and concepts that they're looking at. And of course, APIs are a key underpinning of all of these. And so they really are that core foundation. I mean, if I just take a simple web page, if you will, there are many different APIs that are involved here, whether you're actually looking to provide the context behind a particular product, the product information itself, whether you're actually using underlying analytical capabilities to be able to make this material very relevant and contextual to the individual. A lot of this is being driven by APIs. And so APIs are really, quite frankly, all around us. There's a lot of APIs that are being utilized in order to deliver the capabilities that we use every day. So APIs are important, the technology is important, but also the API program is a very, very key component of how successful you're going to be with APIs in general. Right. So it's really that cornerstone, that core foundation. If you don't have a very solid and really well thought out API program, you can come up with the greatest technologies in the world and the greatest, latest GraphQL strategy or whatever it might be. But it's likely that you're not going to get the largest amount of value out of your API initiative without that core underlying solid program. And so that was really the premise behind a lot of the book, was just to say, what are some of those key things that people need to think about? Not to be completely 100% prescriptive, because of course it's not a one size fits all sort of situation, but really just point out some key things that people need to think about. They need to incorporate into an API program. And if they don't, at least they did so consciously. Right? So it was an actual decision that they made to either exclude something or include something within the program itself. Right. So the API program is critical. And so that's really for today and for the book itself. There's a number of different areas. We're going to touch on this subset here that you see, but we're going to touch on a subset of the topics. But that was really the intent of this particular book, was to focus on the program itself. So firstly, and for a lot of organizations, there was this conversation around using APIs as a monetization strategy initially. This was probably when APIs were first really gaining a lot of traction in organizations. There was excitement around the fact that, oh, well, if we just build a bunch of APIs, we can make a bunch of money from those APIs. And that, of course, unless you're in certain industries or you were a startup or certain organizations where that was part of your core offering and service, that idea of monetization wasn't necessarily the best place for organizations to start. Right. So now I find that once organizations have gone through developing APIs for other reasons, and we'll talk about that in a moment, monetization is now becoming interesting again. And of course, you've got other initiatives such as open banking, and how does that relate back to what organizations provide as services? And APIs in many cases are now enablers for the new fintechs around how they are providing their applications and capabilities and how they're making money. But initially, it was more around things like enabling existing components and exposing those as APIs to make it easier for partners to integrate with those components. It was around how do you facilitate or streamline internal integration activities? How do I make it easier for application A to talk to application B? How do I do so in a decoupled fashion? How do I quickly assemble new services that are comprised of lower level APIs? And that drives new capabilities, again, for my customers and partners. So a large part of the initiatives behind an API program, the initial excitement was around monetization. Then it became more around some of the practical aspects of what APIs can bring. And now I'm finding that monetization is a renewed topic in many of my customers today. But as you can see, there's a whole range here. I can charge just by accessing the APIs themselves. I can add APIs as sort of an additional upsell opportunity if I'm providing a service. APIs are an additional subscription or an additional cost, if you will, for a service that you're providing. It can support revenue generating activities. It can support better interaction with your partners, or it can just be, and what was typically used initially, a way to improve operational efficiency. So many different ways in which you can think about monetization. Now, when you think about the roles on an API team, if I am building an API program, I need a number of roles that are part of that program, right? They're part of that API team. And I've listed some of them here, and there's likely others. But when you look at it, there's a very diverse set, and quite frankly, a very large set of roles that one needs to look at when you are building, again, your overall API program and API team. Now, this isn't people. So this doesn't mean that I need however many circles are on this particular diagram as individual people. But this does mean that I need to at least go through each of these roles and see if there's an individual that can match or fulfill a number of these different roles. In some cases, it's going to be the same person. So the people that are the product manager, they may also be responsible for some of the marketing around an API program. And remember, internal marketing is also important. But some of these are, of course, can be combined, and it could be the same individual fulfilling one or more of these roles. But you at least need to think about each of these roles because they are key roles in an API team. And regardless of whether you're a software vendor like TIBCO, but if you're looking at just, you're an organization providing core services to your customers and partners, and oh, by the way, APIs are one of the ways by which you're doing that, you still need things like, how am I going to market the APIs? How am I going to effectively sell the value of the APIs? Right? Even if it's an internal API program, I still need to sell the value of the APIs. Well, who's going to do that? Right? Who's going to be that evangelist? Who's going to support my internal development organizations as they're looking to use APIs? Right, so those are the kinds of things that you need to think about. So even if you're purely using APIs for internal purposes, you still need some of these more what might be considered traditional outbound marketing roles. You still need to think about that at the very least, even for programs that are focused on internal development and usage. Right, so a large part about APIs is around the roles and how you actually think about those roles when building out the program itself. Okay, so one of the things that often comes up is building the business case behind a program. And most organizations that I talk to now have gone through this cycle, and they've established a form of a program that's in place already, right? But that's not the only time you need a business case for your program. So of course, once you've established how you're going to provide APIs throughout your organization, that process by which you monitor and measure the success of that program, that is forever. It's ongoing, right? It's continuous. It's a forever thing. You don't just set up your program, come up with some initial metrics and say, yep, my program was successful year one, and then you're finished, right? That is not the case. And so, there is an evolution of the business case as well. So as the world changes, as competitors change, as the services you offer changes, your business case is also going to change. And so you need to revisit this. And I usually talk about revisiting it at a regular basis, whether that's a quick glance at your metrics and KPIs and your business case. Maybe that's quarterly, maybe that's twice a year, maybe that's yearly. It's going to depend on the organization and how you're using your API program, but it is still something that you need to do. Right. So this is something that one does need to revisit. It's not something that you just set up at the very beginning and then effectively forget about. And so in many cases, I often use, there's different techniques that you can use. One of the ones that I've seen being used successfully is really this idea of the business model canvas. This is often the way in which actually, quite frankly, startups will define what they do. But it's also a very useful way to kind of categorize and break down the different things you need to think about when you're building out or whether you're revamping or enhancing the business case for your API program. Right? So you want to look at things like, well, who are my key partners for the API programs? What opportunities do I have, both internal and external? And what key activities do I need in order to achieve that value? Not only activities, but resources. Right? Who do I need to help me achieve that value? What are the value propositions that an API program is going to bring? Right? And again, that can be both internal facing and external facing. And if I am dealing with APIs externally, what types of relationships do I need to build with my customers to be able to make them kind of feel like they're engaged with my API program? Right? How am I going to distribute those APIs? In terms of, they talk about customer segments. So for customers that are not partners, how am I going to cover those customers? Are they internal? Are they external? How am I going to support them? What documentation do they need? The cost structure is probably the one that most people will start with, right? What does it cost me to set up my program and run it, staff it, and so on? And then also from a revenue standpoint, how do I drive or determine the revenue that's associated with my API program? And again, that is related to potentially things like new sources of monetization, the way in which I can price these things. There's just different ways in which I can actually drive revenue again for my API program. So I often find that by thinking about each one of these groups and then applying metrics to each of these, it's actually a very useful way to look at a business case for an API program. Now, again, not saying that this is the only way, but it really does help to kind of put some structure around how that business case is going to be built, presented, and how it's going to carry on going forward. Okay, so a large part of an API program success is around adoption, of course. So how do you get people to adopt your APIs, use your APIs, and build systems, applications, new APIs, whatever that is, new products, and so on top of those APIs? So to do that, you need to figure out who your audience is, right? Who's your target audience? If it's partners, then you're going to market, if you will, those APIs in one way. If it's internal developers, you're going to market to them in a different way, right? And so you need to figure out who it is that you're going after with your APIs, who's going to be using them, who's going to be consuming them, and then figure out what is the best way to interact with those personas, those users, in order to make them aware that the APIs exist. How are they going to get support again for the APIs? As I mentioned, things like documentation. How am I going to figure out who do they contact when it comes to running into issues with your APIs? Right? These are all things that the personas are going to drive. Right? Do I need a community for my APIs? Right? How do I publish my documentation? Right? How do I allow people to test my APIs before I actually allow them to hit my production systems, for example? Right? Those are the kinds of things that I need to think about. And so really figuring out who your audience is and then building an experience for your API program to match that audience is just as critical as the APIs themselves. And if nobody knows about them, or if the support behind them is just not that great, the APIs are just not going to be adopted, and you'll run into situations where people are now building their own APIs because it's quite frankly simpler, faster, easier, better, right? If your APIs over here are too difficult. Finally, you get into almost finally, you get into what is the more stereotypical thing that people will look at when they're coming up with when they're looking at their API program, right? How do I design my APIs? How do I develop my APIs? How do I do my testing? How am I going to deploy them? And then I find that one area that often does not receive enough attention up front is this idea of how am I going to version my APIs? So how am I going to roll out a new version of this particular API? How am I going to deprecate APIs, which implies that I know who's using them or who's not using them? And then how am I going to monitor and manage those APIs? Right? And in many cases, especially when API programs are first being established, there's a lot of focus on what are my APIs going to be and how am I going to design them and what cool tool am I going to use to build these APIs? Are they REST? Are they GraphQL? Are they combinations thereof? What level of REST do I go to? All those conversations come into play. And then but people don't pay enough attention to, well, once my APIs are there, how do I change them? How do I upgrade them? How do I tell all the consumers of those APIs that I'm upgrading those APIs? How do I prevent people from having to go back and rewrite a bunch of their code because I changed my APIs? And then also deprecation is important. Eventually, I'm going to run into the point where I need to know when to stop supporting an API. And how am I going to know that? Well, one way to know that, of course, is to have a proper set of monitoring capabilities around these APIs to know who's using them and to what extent they're using them, right? Because that's, of course, a very critical element as well. So this is, very, very important life cycle. This is where a lot of people will start. Arguably, I want to kind of pull people back a little bit and have them think about some of the other topics that I've already gone through. This is obviously a very core part of what an API program will facilitate. The other thing I always talk about is bring your testing forward. You want to be able to test things like your API contracts earlier rather than later. It does me no good to build a bunch of code or microservices or functions or whatever it is behind those APIs, only to find out later that the actual interface or contract was not the way that it should be, which then forces me to potentially have to readjust my code that is supporting those APIs. Right? So things like mock applications and even standing up mock applications for external partners to test, as an example, all those kinds of things are very important. You want to do that earlier rather than later. You also get into the conversation around agile methodologies. Most organizations aren't really so much focused on, of course, traditional waterfall, but usually it's like a hybrid. You'll hear the term water scrum fall. But the idea that part of the process might be more of a waterfall model, the other part of the process might be more agile. right? So you do need to figure out how you're going to support different development activities through your API program. Okay, so as I mentioned, the API contract is key. Right? You need that interface to be solid. That is the piece that people are going to be interacting with. That's what they're going to be effectively using. And so as a result, you want to make sure that particular contract, that interface is well thought out. Right? And it's kind of similar to a bad database design, right? If you come up with a bad schema for your database design, it's going to get harder and harder to use that particular database, if you will. And so then people get all these kind of workarounds and they try and kind of do things, weird and wonderful things around that database in order to make it much more useful or consumable or make it more performant or whatever it is. Right? Just like you need a proper database schema, you need a proper API model up front, an API contract. Utilize standards, of course, where possible. Things like the Open API specification or Swagger, things like GraphQL and the schema definition language, things like JSON schema, things like the async API specification for more event-driven APIs. Right? Look to see what standards are available. And of course, for certain verticals, there are other standards that might exist in terms of how do I define industry-specific APIs and payloads. So open banking would be a good example. There's some good definitions in terms of what it means to actually define a set of APIs related to payments or cards or whatever it is, those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that you're following, of course, whatever standards exist for your vertical. Automate as much as possible. So CI/CD, everybody's talking about this nowadays, DevOps, DevSecOps, data ops, model ops, everything's in ops nowadays, I think. But automation is critical, right? This is how you're going to facilitate the rollout of new capabilities to support those APIs that you've already put out there, or new APIs that you're then building on top of existing capabilities or existing APIs. Right? So when I say, when you think you've automated everything, automate again is the way to kind of look at it. But automation, of course, is critical. And then also understand the way in which you're deploying these APIs. So now this gets into the infrastructure. Is it very much related around things like private cloud, public cloud? Is it hybrid? Are you developing or creating a multi-cloud strategy? So some components are going to be exposed through AWS and some are going to be exposed through Azure, just to pick a couple of examples. Am I deploying APIs in a Kubernetes context? Am I using a service mesh to really facilitate that east-west style of microservice-based communications? Right? How do I use that to facilitate the development of core services which are supporting my APIs? Right? Are they going to be synchronous in nature? Are they asynchronous in nature? Am I using things like back-end for front-end patterns? Do I need sagas? Do I need some sort of layer which choreographs or orchestrates different APIs together? Right. So these are all different things that I need to think about that are related. Right? They're all related topics and also very relevant when I'm building solutions or applications or capabilities on top of or as part of an API program. So lots of things to think about. Another way to look at it here, of course, is you can start with the model. You can test those APIs through the use of things like mock apps and so on. I also say that this is a great time to actually test the security model. Right? Many times people will leave the security aspect of APIs until more the end, if you will. After things have been built and they're starting to deploy these things and there's some testing going on later on in the life cycle and so on. But I always say try and pull that testing of the security model up front. So even before the services themselves are built. Right? So you create your API contracts, you build your mock applications from those contracts, you stand up those mock applications, which are representative in terms of the ways in which people will interact with those APIs, and incorporate security at that level, and then test at that point, right? To make sure that the security model that you want to use for your APIs is sufficient and appropriate for the way in which they're going to be utilized and consumed. Okay. And then a large part of this is the idea behind, do I go with a service mesh? And maybe that is a strong enough capability to support the APIs and the services underneath the covers. Do I need something like an API gateway, or do I need to go to a full API management platform? Right. So you need to determine what it is that you need. What are those elements that are going to be really key drivers or key support capabilities for your API program? How broad do I need this platform to be? And again, does it need to cover APIs that are being deployed in a private cloud versus and or APIs that are deployed in the public cloud? So that hybrid or multi-cloud context that I talked about. So how far do you need to go with what you need from a management standpoint? Right? And this is getting into things like abstracting out how you're going to manage users and roles, how you're going to throttle different API endpoints, if you will, how you're going to package your APIs into products, into plans, how you're going to actually manage, again, the traffic, the keys, how you're going to make sure that it's self-service, right? So a developer can quickly and easily go through your API catalog, figure out what you have, easily test it, get code snippets, right? How am I going to expose all that to the developer community or the people that are using your APIs? Again, change management. How am I going to report on my APIs and their usage? Performance, right? So there's many things that are going to come into play here when you're looking at how far you need to go when it comes to API management and API management capabilities. Right. So the one thing I always do say is make sure there is some central place. So even if you have APIs and that are only being consumed and used internally, you still want to make sure that it's easy for people to discover what those APIs are and how to work with them. Right. So set up, even if it's some basic internal kind of developer portal thing, make sure that something does exist, right, with proper documentation that's also up to date, which can sometimes be a challenge. Hence the automation. Don't just automate how you roll out your APIs, but also automate things like the creation of the associated documentation, right, and make that part of your CI/CD pipeline. But that is a key aspect, right? If the information is too hard to find or the documentation is too hard to use, if I don't have clear samples, again, whether it's internal or external, doesn't really matter. The APIs are just potentially going to be more time consuming to use, more difficult, or worst case is people go off and start to build their own parallel APIs just because they found your current APIs too hard to use. All right, so then we look at some of the future of APIs. And this is really quite a varied topic, and we could probably spend a whole session just on the future of APIs and where we're going to find APIs, how APIs are going to be used in other areas of technology, if you will, just to support the adoption of these other capabilities within an organization. So I've listed a few here. So of course, IoT kind of comes and goes in waves, I find. I don't know if people remember RFID and all the RFID tags and everything was going to be tagged and so on and so forth. A lot of that kind of went away. But now I'm finding that organizations are really looking at IoT again. A lot of the conversations I have are around using devices, device capabilities, and so on to really enrich the capabilities that organizations are either using to run their business or the capabilities that they're providing to their customers and partners. And of course, it's things like 5G. It's the idea that I need to reduce decision latency. I've got more decisions being made in a distributed fashion. And so that's being driven a lot by information that's coming from IoT devices. So I need to make sure that I can support the idea of having these devices and running them and having analytical models run closer to the edge. So APIs are going to be critical in that particular environment. You've got the APIs for the devices themselves, and then you've got the APIs that are being utilized at the edge or on the edge for running things like an anomaly detection model at the edge or a computer vision model at the edge, right? Maybe I need to process streaming video for the purposes of quality control on a factory line. Right? That would be an example. There's going to be a lot of APIs that are involved there. So APIs are not just about sort of a central core, I wrapped my ERP systems or whatever it is. APIs are, of course, very, very relevant in an IoT context as well. Also very relevant, as I've alluded to, around AI ML. Right? So this is the idea of once I've built my models, my AI ML models, and now I'm finding that that's typically not the problem. People have lots of models. Whether they're accurate or not is a different conversation, and that's largely based on the process and on the data that they're derived from. But a large part of this is they've got lots of models. How do I deploy and use them and consume them? And I need to do that both in a batch and also a real-time context. So anomaly detection, for example, on a factory floor, as I mentioned, I need to do that sooner rather than later. It does me no good to find out that all those products that I manufactured, when I ran my batch job last night, all those things I did yesterday, they're all bad. I need to throw them all away, right? Obviously, you can't do that. And so the ability to incorporate and run AI/ML models in a real-time context is important. And APIs, of course, can help facilitate that. So a lot of the work that we do is around packaging of models, deploying those models, operationalizing them, and again, doing that wherever those models need to be executed, whether they're cloud native models being provided by Azure and AWS and so on, whether they're capabilities at the edge, in the private cloud, whatever those things need to be, APIs can help drive and facilitate that. As I always say, APIs are no longer just about REST and HTTP. Right? They're not just about request reply. APIs are very much also being used as a way to actually facilitate the creation of an event-driven architecture. So I can now have APIs and use API specifications specifications, yeah. So like the async APIs, and actually use those as a way to define APIs, which are going to be very event-driven. So APIs that would wrap, if you will, or be powered by something like Kafka under the covers, right? So I want to create a contract that talks about the payload and also creates a definition of the broker that's going to be used in order to facilitate, again, that event-driven style of communications. So APIs are no longer just about REST and HTTP. There's GraphQL. Again, you can take REST to different forms. Maybe you're using things like Hadios and stuff like that in terms of how you're implementing the REST style of APIs. But there's more than one style. And that's important for organizations to realize that when you're talking about APIs or even just microservices, let's say, it's not just about REST and HTTP. We're doing some work now, and it's interesting. I think a lot of the pandemic, if you will, has really brought about the need to interact with data and interact with one's environment, if you will, in different ways. And one of the ways that people are looking to do that is through augmented reality or extended reality, which includes also VR or mixed. But in many ways, people are saying, well, I want to use things like augmented reality to look at my surroundings. Let's say it's a piece of equipment as an example. And then I want to superimpose maybe information about that piece of equipment. When was it last maintained? Who's the manufacturer? Some other key metrics and attributes. And then I also want to have real-time information be delivered to me as well, and do that in an augmented reality experience. And so APIs, of course, can help drive that, because I'm going back and I'm going to my master data management system or my reference data management system and getting the information about that equipment. I'm getting information from another system which has got my maintenance history. I'm getting information from the IoT devices which are providing me real-time vibration details. Right? Those are the kinds of things that I can bring together into a single augmented reality experience and use that as a way to help facilitate the way in which people are interacting with their environment. Right. So it's this idea of it's different ways of consuming data, right? Just like people are using natural language as a way to consume data. People are now breaking their data into graphs and using graphs to represent knowledge and querying the information in that fashion. Augmented reality or extended reality techniques can be another way. And of course, that's also powered by APIs underneath the covers. Blockchain, lots of debates on blockchain still. I still get into conversations around that. A little less around hype. There's not so much hype around cryptocurrencies and things like that as much, especially when it comes to the enterprise, if you will. But there are still very relevant use cases around blockchain, sort of supply chain related use cases, track and trace, IoT as inputs, things like that. And of course, a lot of the business logic in a blockchain, they're called smart contracts. A lot of the business logic can be exposed through APIs so that I can integrate with enterprise systems. And so we do a lot of work with blockchain, being able to allow you to use low-code development approaches to build the smart contracts and then expose those as APIs so that you can interact with enterprise systems with those, between the two, right? But between the blockchain and the applications themselves. Right? So APIs are key there. Then you get into other areas like autonomic computing and having a set of distributed agents, if you will, really working and collaborating together without human involvement. And so this is, of course, powered by things like IoT. So think smart city, smart grid, cars talking to bridges and infrastructure and that kind of stuff. So these are now edge capabilities or autonomous software agents. talking to one another and working with one another in order to achieve a certain set of goals. And so it's not a new concept. This concept has been out for a while, but because of the capabilities of technology have evolved to the point where some of this is now feasible, we've been doing some work in that area. And of course, APIs are key to driving that. And then I've touched on the standards and whatnot already. So this is, APIs still very relevant. But APIs are going to start to show up in a lot of these different areas as people look to build new and emerging capabilities in order to expand what the services that they provide to their customers and partners. Data as APIs is the last one that I'll touch on. We also see this idea of people really, of course, being very focused on data. Data is now a very first-class citizen, if you will, in the conversations that I typically have with organizations. They're really trying to get, of course, a handle on their data. And I don't even say the word big data anymore. That's not even relevant. Everybody's got a challenge with data, right? How do I collect it? How do I organize it? How do I make sure that the data is of high quality? How do I catalog it? Where do I put it? How do I run and build analytical models against it? How do I operationalize those models? What's the governance around that whole process? A lot of different topics around data. But one of the things that people are looking to do is, I've got data parked in these systems. How do I then essentially merge, if you will, that data into a set of virtualized views, let's say? I don't want to have to do all these ETL jobs and move data around all over the place, nor is it feasible in some circumstances to have everything in a single data lake. So how do I make it look like it's coming from a single location and then make it easily consumable through APIs? Right? And so APIs are a critical part of this whole data as APIs initiative, where people are taking their data sources, virtualizing them, putting some security around those views, and then allowing people to consume the data through those views without accessing the backend data sources directly. Right? And that helps in terms of security. It helps in terms of making it easier for people to consume the data. It provides or enables me with more control over how people are accessing the underlying data sources. It also helps with migration. So if I'm moving from a data source on-prem to more of a cloud store, I can have data consumers talking to the APIs and then move things around behind the covers. And in theory, the data consumer shouldn't really know, shouldn't care, right? Since they're using APIs, they're not directly tied to the underlying data source. And so as a result, I can do things underneath the covers, if you will, without the actual consumers of that data either knowing or being greatly impacted by that move. Right? So data as APIs is another hot topic that I find a lot of organizations are looking at, and it's just part of an overall broader data strategy. Right? It's kind of like the conversation that we have now with data lakes versus the idea of an enterprise data mesh or data fabric. How much do you centralize, and how much do you leave to certain business units or properly bounded business contexts, if you will? Who's going to own the data? How are they going to store it? How are they going to expose it? What gets put into the data lake? How are analytics going to be run on it, and so on? Right? So it's another related topic, definitely, when it comes to APIs, API programs, and data. So I touched on a lot of things, hopefully, for everybody here on the session. And hopefully there's some things in there that give you some things to think about, or just go back and revisit potentially, or even just to give you an idea of where else APIs are being built, used, produced, consumed, and so on, as you look at other areas of technology and different programs in your organization. But they really are a key part of any sort of successful digital transformation strategy, right? I mean, they're embedded, they're really a key focus. But along with that, of course, comes a lot of complexity. So hopefully this helps. I know I didn't touch on any technical aspects. So, how you write and bring Visual Studio Code down here and actually create your APIs themselves. That's not the intent of this session, nor is it the intent of the book. But hopefully that gives you a few things to think about when developing and building out your API program.